So the way that we share this information is changing daily. And so we're always having to keep up. Okay, let's.
Best thing about this interview is that we don't have to wear a mask.
See, isn't that great?
Awesome.
Okay. And now folks on Facebook should be able to see us.
Well, we'll see them as they scroll through the top.
Yes. So welcome. There we are. All right. Let's get that up. Perfect. Welcome everybody to Nosh Schmooze. And I am your host, Rachel Kaplan. I'm so happy today to have with me our amazing guests, Cindy White and Saul Berenthal, here to talk to us about Jewish Cuba, past and present. And as always, if you have questions for our guests, you can post them in the comments on Facebook, and I'm happy to field them to them. But in the meantime, let me tell you a little bit about our guests. So, Saul Berenthal was born in Havana in 1944, where his parents found refuge after fleeing Europe, but fled again to Miami in 1960 following the 1959 Castro Revolution. After graduating, he started a job with IBM and later built a couple of successful software businesses, achieving the proverbial American dream. He started going back to Cuba about a dozen years ago. As he was semi-retired after selling his software company, he took an interest in revisiting his former homeland. In a somewhat of a bittersweet return, he saw a faded and worn reminder of his childhood, but with limitless potential to return to its former glory with the right environment. As a businessman, he saw that there were opportunities to help the Cuban people by developing their own economy. You may recognize his name as he was featured prominently in the news as the founder of the first American company licensed under the Obama administration to do business in Cuba. Unfortunately, politics got in the way and the Cuban government elected to not pursue the idea. From there, he turned to the next most promising element of the economy, travel. His hope is that by bringing travelers, they can expose the world to what Cuba has to offer, bringing much needed aid, and most importantly, driving interactions with private local businesses to help the community become more self-sufficient. And our other guest today, Cindy White, was born in Brooklyn, New York, to two Cuban parents. Saul is one of which, and grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and graduated from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's in arts and journalism. After visiting Cuba for the first time in 2008 with her father and seeing the needs of the community, she, along with her family, opened up a B&B right outside of downtown Havana, and a Cuba-only travel agency specializing in bringing Jewish groups to the island. They decided to make it a kosher B&B, the first and only in Cuba, to be able to include the Jewish population that are not easily able to travel there because of dietary restrictions. She has always loved art and is proud to be the US representative of a famed Cuban artist. So welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you, or should I say bienvenidos?
Yes.
And, you know, my first question, I think obviously there's a lot of South Floridians that were knowledgeable that, you know, there are Cuban influences here, but I don't know that everybody knows how Jews got to Cuba. So how did the Cuban come to exist?
First of all, thank you for having us. I appreciate giving us the time to talk a little bit about something that we're very interested in doing, have been doing for a while, and are planning to continue doing. I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the Jews in Cuba from a historical perspective, but more important, I'll tell you the Jews in Cuba while I lived part of that story and are still living part of that story. So let's go back as to when was it that the first Jews got to Cuba? Well, the first Jews got to Cuba with Christopher Columbus. It was really during the time of Inquisition that Columbus came over to discover America. At that time, because of the Inquisition, the jails in Spain were full of Jews that were put in prison because they didn't want to convert to Catholicism. The Jews were classified as two types. The conversos, those Jews that said that they would convert, but not necessarily did, and the marranos, who were the Jews that refused to convert. Those were the guys in jail. Marrano, by the way, is a Spanish word for pig. So there is a little bit of a relationship between Jews and being pigs, etc. But it was the opportunity to leave jail to go on an adventure with Columbus that gave some of the Jewish people in jail the idea to come with Columbus, and they did come in the trip, several of them. But the other reality of the trip was that not only Jews from jail came to the trip, but Jews from Portugal were also involved in that trip. It was Jews from Portugal that financed Columbus's trip. It was not Queen Isabella selling her jewels, as is usually taught in places. It was really Jewish people in Portugal that believed that Columbus was going to find the lost tribe in his journey towards India. So that was the first time that Jews were physically in Cuba, but it didn't take, because most of the Jews that stayed there became Catholics. So there was no Jewish presence, so to speak. The first real presence, believe it or not, came with Americans during the Spanish-American War. It was Cuba that was waging war of independence against Spain that asked Americans to help. And Americans came to Cuba, declared war against Spain, called it the Spanish-American War. And soldiers that were part of that expedition later came to Cuba and established the first Jewish colony, so to speak, in Cuba. The first Jewish cemetery was built by them. It exists today in Guanabacoa. After World War I and World War II, there were two more waves of Jews fleeing the war and, of course, the Holocaust. The first wave after World War I was Sephardic Jews. The second wave was Ashkenazi Jews, and that's where my parents and my wife's parents came to Cuba, fleeing the Holocaust and hoping to be able to get into the US. There were quotas at the time, so it was difficult to migrate to the US, and they ended up deciding to stay in Cuba. They met each other in Cuba, they were settled in Cuba, and they got married. The same thing happened to my wife's parents. They were also refugees from the war and were able to stay in Cuba, met each other, and got married. So I kind of got married within the species. Me and my wife are both Cubans that were born and raised in Cuba.
And would you say that that's, rare in terms of, Cubans that exist today? Are there still Cubans in Cuba right now? Are they practicing Jews?
Yes, I'll tell you a little bit of my part of living history of Judaism in Cuba. I was raised as Cuban Jew. In Cuba, we had the traditional three synagogues. You have two Jews, you gotta have three synagogues. And the synagogues are Sephardic synagogue, Ashkenazi synagogue, and a Orthodox synagogues. They are in existence. Due to COVID, right now, COVID-19, they're not open to the public, but they are actually living synagogues. And there are congregations that belong to them, the largest one being the Ashkenazi synagogue known as El Patronato. El Patronato is the main synagogue The Sephardic synagogue follows it in terms of number of people, and then, of course, the Orthodox having the least number of members. Mainly because there's really no orthodoxy in Cuba, having been a place where kosher food disappeared for many years. It's very difficult to practice Orthodox religion in Cuba. But yes, they are in existence. They exist. When we left, 1960, about a year and a half, 2 years after the revolution, there were in excess of 18,000 Jews. Nowadays, there are somewhere between 800 and 1,200 Jews in Cuba, most of them in Havana, and most of them converts to Judaism as opposed to being born from Jewish heritage. But they are very involved with Judaism because Cuba and the Cuban people per se are very spiritual in nature. And by studying the Jewish religions, many of them have found themselves very comfortable in the religion and have married to other Jews that exist in Cuba. So there is, although the majority is converted Jews, there is a well-established somewhere between 800 and 1,200 Jews living in Cuba today. They themselves are kind of, because of all the political issues, are not very connected to world Judaism, which is one of the reasons why we concentrate on trying to bring Jews from other parts of the world, Canada, the US, Europe, Israel, etc., to bring to Cuba, to the Cuban Jews, Judaism from other countries, to let them know that they're not alone, to let them know that they are of interest, to let them know that we are there to help. And bringing the principles of Judaism as well as Orthodoxy is one of the things that we are trying to achieve with our endeavors in Cuba today.
So you mentioned that, it was pretty much impossible to have kosher food on the island. I'm very curious how you've managed to create a kosher hotel in Cuba in that environment.
Well, it's called a combination of import-export. We bring all the necessary parts of kosher ingredients to Cuba. We either send them by ship or we bring them on airplanes with us, and even some of our guests bring them to help out to have the proper conditions. And at this point, what we're doing is having a parva establishment. So we don't do meat or chicken or anything like that. It's fish, vegetable, fruit, pasta, eggs, all kinds of food that do not require fleischiks. It's parva milchiks.
That makes it a little easier.
It makes it a little bit easier, but we still have to do things like baking of the bread, bringing all the other kosher ingredients, including wine and everything else. But we're working on establishing a bakery. This is a project that we started before the COVID came onto being, and we had to stop, but we are now restarting the ability to have a bakery as well in Cuba to cater to the Jews in Cuba, as well as those groups of Jews that come to Cuba. The next stage will be, of course, to establish the ability for a shochet to come to Cuba and start with small animals like chicken and ducks and that kind of stuff. And eventually we'll work ourselves up to full kosher fleischiks and milchiks. We're hoping that the new administration will open up the ability to do commerce with Cuba, so it'll make it much easier to happen.
So I definitely have questions about that. I do first want to ask Cindy, you first came to Cuba when you were an adult, being raised by Cuban parents. I'm curious, like, what was that like for you first coming to, the country where they grew up and being exposed to that culture?
Well, I mean, all my life I was hearing stories about, this place and that place and everywhere, that they, that meant something to them when they were growing up. So to see those things, it was cool. But to see it with my dad, he hadn't been back in 60 years. So it was, a very emotional experience. We went with a bunch of Cubans that like my parents' age that had left, and my brother and I and a lot of the kids. So it was very, very cool.
And did you still have family that had stayed in Cuba that whole time, or all of your family had left?
Yeah, they all left. But since then, I mean, we've made friends that are like family there. So yeah.
That's so nice. Do you feel like you're connected with the Jewish community there?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when we bring our groups over, we try to go there and have a meal with them. You know, like we try to bring in the groups to feel like they're part of it. And the community there, like the youth community, will do dances, and it's very cool.
Awesome. And how do you feel like the Jewish community in Cuba is different from the Jewish community that you grew up with?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's like night and day. I mean, the prayers, they actually don't have a rabbi in Cuba. So it's, you know, congregation led, and the Ashkenazic synagogue, which my parents grew up in, have a lot of the youth. The Sephardic one has the older population, but the Ashkenazic has the youth. And so it's very vibrant and just fun.
That's awesome. That warms my heart to hear. You know, I growing up in South Florida, I had like Cuban friends growing up, right? And I also had Latinx friends that not necessarily from Cuba, but also that they were raised Catholic, but had some kind of an affinity towards Judaism. And I'm very curious if, you know, somewhere down the line they were conversos in their family, and, you know, because I've had friends express that they like felt like they had a Jewish soul and things like that. So
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
curious. So Saul, you know, you mentioned things might be changing now with the new U.S. presidential administration, and that originally, you know, the government, the Cuban government, prevented you from doing that kind of business. How do you feel like things might change, you know, in the coming weeks or years?
Without getting into the political atmosphere, what we're trying to establish nowadays is pretty much what we tried before with the tractor project. I'm a believer that through commerce, a lot of the issues that exist between the Cubans in Cuba and the Cubans in the US could improve. The policy of the US is pretty much dictated by a small group in Florida that has resentments with what happened today during our generation. I was part of what happened in Cuba when the revolution took over. Most of the Jewish people there were merchants. Under a communist system, a merchant has no reason to exist. Therefore, most of the Jews that left because of that. But many of the Cuban families that left also left because of that. And everybody felt like things were taken away from them, their businesses, their houses, their goods, their properties, etc. And there's a lot of resentment that brings over. But I think that Jewish people over the centuries have gone through very, very similar circumstances in other countries, that like the Inquisition in Spain or the pogroms in Europe made the Jewish people go and lose everything that they had, especially the one during the Holocaust in Germany. Nowadays, the state of Israel and Germany have very good relations. The Jewish people have not forgotten, but I think forgiven the Holocaust. How can what happened in Cuba be compared to that? How can the Cubans, not only the Cuban Jews, but the Cubans in general, not forget, but forgive the fact that these things were taken away from them? Oh, and by the way, what's the best way that you can recoup what was taken away from you? By taking advantage of opportunities, economical opportunities that are becoming available in Cuba today. If the Cuban government took things that were yours and now they're saying, why don't you come and invest in here so that you can help us prosper and prosper yourself? Why not take advantage of that? That reminds me of a conversation that I had with my father. We had software development business that was worldwide, and I was about to open an office in Hamburg, Germany. So I went to my father and asked him the traditional question: do you have any problems me having an office in Hamburg to expand our business? And he said, is that an opportunity that's going to make you money? I said, of course, I wouldn't do it otherwise. He says, well, that's the way that you have to be able to recoup what was taken away from our family and many other Jewish families in the past. Of course, why not take advantage of that? It's mutually beneficial, and it does provide you with, we got even, or at least we got back what was stolen from us. And that's the way that I think about how should Cuban from Cuba and Cuban Americans stop the hate and start the healing through commerce.
I think that's an interesting and unique perspective on it. And, you know, not to minimize the trauma that people might be feeling from, you know, being forced out of their homes and into a new country. But, you know, there's definitely ways of healing and coming together, and why not do it through business?
And it's a beautiful way of being able to say the past is past. Let's work in the future, which is what's important. Most of the people and most of the Cuban in the US have relatives and families in Cuba that they want to help. It's just an issue with politics and government that prevents things from happening.
Right.
The Cuban people are noble people. The Cuban people care about their friends and families in Cuba. They want to be able to help. But in order to do that, they have to not forget, but forgive.
So that being the case, you know, looking to the future of Cuba and hopefully, you know, coming to the other side of the pandemic, folks in the States now that are 65 and older at least, or healthcare workers, you know, are being vaccinated right now, or maybe have already, you know, received their 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. So what might this look like if they're able to travel to Cuba? What might they expect there?
Right. I was in Cuba through the end of December. We just came back a few weeks ago. So we spent a couple of weeks in Cuba during the end of December, and I wanted to be there. We have a house in Cuba, so we are Cuban citizens as well as American citizens. We are residents both in Cuba and the US, so we have the ability to go back and forth. Both me and my wife, as well as Cindy and my son Scott, are all Cuban citizens and residents as well. So to us, it's very easy to hop on a plane and go to Cuba and be at home and feel comfortable and everything else. So when we first got to Cuba, I knew about the statistics. I knew that the number of cases in Cuba was very, very small compared to the rest of the world. I knew that the number of deaths in Cuba was very, very small compared to the rest of the world. And I also knew that over there they have very, very specific regulations as to how to treat COVID, the mask and the distancing and everything else. And they do make sure that people comply with them. But the most interesting aspect of it is the Cuban medical system. The health system in Cuba is what I would call a proactive health system. People don't wait until they're sick to go to see the doctors. The doctors come to the people, to the neighborhood, and check on the people and make sure that they're feeling okay, that they don't have any problems. So it's a proactive system that accomplishes something that is very important. People get treated as early as possible when there is something being developed in their systems. So it is one of the benefits of the Cuban government system. They have access to health care at all times for any reason. And even if the person doesn't come, the health system goes to the person to make sure that they're doing all right. Well, something very similar happened when we went there. The first thing that they did at the airport when we came in was to give us a test, a COVID-19 test. In order to enter Cuba, you have to have a test. We, of course, did one before we left, just to make sure that we were not going to go to Cuba not being negative. So we got the test, we were negative, we proceeded to travel. But nonetheless, once you got there, they gave you that test and they told you, you stay in your house for 2 days, we'll bring the results. And if you're negative, we'll let you walk around the neighborhood and wear your mask and don't fraternize with a lot of people and all that. And in 5 more days, we'll come back and we'll do another test. And if you're negative, then you can do your thing. And that's exactly what they did. They came, they checked us up every couple of days just to make sure no fever, no coughing, no aches, no nothing. And then once the second test was completed, everything was fine. So they're very, very good about following the scientific methodology to try to minimize it. But however, with the opening of tourism and the going back and forth from different people to different places, some of those statistics have started to come up again. So they are now enforcing a little bit more control. They are allowing less number of flights. There used to be 8 flights a day from Miami to Cuba. Now I think they're restricted to 3. So they're trying to minimize a little bit the interchange with other countries, and that is beginning to help. Again, of course, with the vaccinations, people who are going to be inoculated will be able to show that they're inoculated and they won't have a problem. So the ability of tourism to Cuba is a combination of both what we do outside Cuba here in the United States in terms of vaccination and what they do there in terms of controlling it themselves. They have a vaccine. They've developed 2 vaccines and they're on trials right now. So they will be vaccinating their own population over the next few months as well. So hopefully, I would say that hopefully by June, July, tourism will be able to start again the way it used to be before.
So that being said, and I know y'all have your hotel, but you also have your travel agency for Cuba. If I want to travel to Cuba, when should I start looking to book? How far out?
Usually 90 days so that you can prepare an itinerary, so that you can get the appropriate visas for the trip, so that you can get all of the venues that you want to visit. In other words, organize a trip to Cuba that once you get there, you will have not only hospitality, but transportation, venues, visits, and interaction with the Jewish community, which is what we specialize on.
Got it. So 90 days in this new reality that we're living in right now. And we'll see what happens in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, everything can be prepared, but not activated until the time in which you make the trip. Right.
And just so folks know, I have shared in the comments links to the Berenthal Cuba only travel agency, as well as the link to Chateau Blanc, which is their kosher boutique hotel. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a bit about the hotel.
Well, yeah, two things that are important to point out. We have 2 businesses. One is an American business, which is the travel operation, the ones that organizes groups and sets up all the traveling arrangements, visas, and all that kind of stuff. And we have a separate business, the Cuban business. One of my objectives in setting up a business in Cuba was to learn how business works in Cuba. What are the rules, the regulations, the taxes, the inspections, etc. So we set up a business in Cuba under the current private sector environment in Cuba, which allows you to set up businesses of this type. Cuba is now in the process of expanding what you would call a private sector, which would allow for other type of activities to occur. The bakery, for example, would be another type of business that we're going to be able to open up. But my dream still goes back to a tractor factory. And we're still working and waiting for the regulations that will allow us to do that. And when the time comes, that's another thing that we're intending to do that doesn't have anything to do with Jewish travel, but it does have a lot to do with the ability to get Cubans the tools that are necessary for them to expand their economy and to prosper, which is to cultivate the land and produce the food that they need to feed themselves.
And that being said, I also shared a link to the charity that you work with, or the partner, Pack for a Purpose.
Yes.
I'm wondering, Cindy, can you tell us a little bit about
Cindy,
that?
Cindy can talk to that.
Yeah, sure.
That's her pet project.
Pack for a Purpose is was started actually by a Jewish woman. She lives here in Raleigh, North Carolina, by us, and it's not just for Cuba. If you go on the website, their motto sort of is, wherever you go, you can have a little bit of space in your suitcase to bring something beneficial to wherever you're traveling. So for Cuba, our B&B, Chateau Blanc, is the destination. So whether you're coming through our travel agency or you're coming through another, if you want to bring something, you can go to their website and it'll tell you, you know, what we need. And our two projects are for the synagogues. So we have one, the Ashkenazic synagogue has a pharmacy that they give medication, not just to the Jewish community, but to the whole community. So we like to bring things for them. And for, like I said, the Sephardic, they're elderly population. So we bring a lot of, you know, donations to help them out.
That's amazing. And if I'm not traveling to Cuba, but I do want to help, is there another way to help with Pack for a Purpose?
Not with Pack for a Purpose, but yeah, you can let us know what part you want to contribute to. We have a few different things, like we do the Pack for a Purpose things, but we're also restoring the Jewish cemetery. So that's actually my mom's project. She's been doing that, and because it's in ruins, and so we're trying to, one gravestone at a time, rebuild it.
Wow. That sounds like a big undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I'm also curious. You have, I love Cuban food, as a lot of people in South Florida do. Is there a particular dish at Chateau Blanc is it generally like Cuban food there, or is it like Jewishly traditional, or is it a combination of it? And do you have a favorite dish?
we try to make a combination. I mean, obviously everything's kosher, but I mean, we figure when people come to Cuba, they want Cuban food. Yeah. So we do try to put the Cuban flavor into the kosher dishes we make.
So what's your favorite thing to eat at the hotel?
Well, it's actually not Cuban, but they make an amazing paella. And so, yeah, we love to have that when they go. And of course, you know, we have our mojitos and have a good time.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
I wish we all had mojitos right now. So, you know, I'm also curious for folks that want to travel to Cuba, or maybe, you know, Cuban Americans that have not been there since, like you have. If you have any like words of wisdom or advice on people's first trip back to Cuba, since, you know, they grew up there, what they should expect that's different.
If I may interrupt, there is one technical, very important issue. People traveling to Cuba that were born in Cuba require a special, different visa, not the same visa that non-Cubans can. I am mentioning it is that they have to specify that they were born in Cuba before they request a visa to go to Cuba. We can provide that visa, but they have to tell us that they were born in Cuba so that we can give them the appropriate visa. Just a technicality.
Good information to have. So specifically, Saul, you know, I'm curious because you had this experience growing up there and then returning back. You know, what should folks expect if they haven't been back for so many years? How Cuba has changed?
Well, the Cuban culture is very similar to what it used to be. Art, music, fun, beaches, all those are the things that the culture in Cuba has completely taken through the years without any change. Some of the changes that have occurred in Cuba have to do with the socialist environment in which they live. In Cuba, like I said, medical services are available to anybody for free. Education is available to anybody to the degree that they can attain in being able to go through as far as they can get into schools and universities. So those two concepts are very much ingrained now in the Cuban mentality. You can start thinking about them in terms of issues that are being discussed and debated here in the US nowadays. So these are very, very strong cultural ties between the Cuban people and their government. So it is something that we can learn and that we can expose ourselves to see how well they work for the purpose. From the point of view of a socialist state, most of the large enterprises are run by the government. But there is also a small private sector, which we are a member, that is beginning to emerge. And it is now through a lot of change, which is going to be expanding it. So these are great times to go and see and learn how a country goes through the process of changing not their culture, but their business culture in terms of how they are going to set up Cuba for the future and its ability to be integrated into the world. Because of the embargo, which hopefully will somehow be diminished, changed, eliminated, whatever you want to call it, Cuba has to become a member of the world business community as well. And that's what they're trying to do. These are very interesting times for people who care about economies and social ambiance and the type of changes that are occurring. It's a very, very interesting time. One of the things that we're doing is we're preparing a tour for a group that is going there to look at opportunities that are opening up for American investments in Cuba. And they're going to be talking with people in the government as well as with people in the economic areas and universities and things of that type, including tourism, agriculture, and medical services, which are the three main interests of investment in Cuba.
Yeah,
Rachel, I'll just, sorry.
Go for
I was
it.
just going to quickly add that, like, when you're saying Cubans who haven't been there for 60 plus years, it's going to be, like, we said earlier, bittersweet. But when we went for the first time and we tried to see the homes where my parents lived, one of them was owned by the government. They wouldn't let us in. So sometimes you can go back and, knock on the door and see your house, but a lot of times you can't.
Yeah, you can't have that expectation.
Right.
I think it's so interesting what you said about the way that the medical system is proactive. It seems like such a foreign concept to me that, medical professionals are actually going out into neighborhoods and making sure that people are, safe and healthy. Like, wow. That just sounds.
Well, you have every neighborhood has a representative, and they go and make sure, have you done this test? Have you, been to see the doctor? It's great.
If you think about it, Rachel, these two concepts of education and health, what better things can a government do for their people than provide them with the best education possible that can be attained by each and every one of the people in the country, as well as to keep them as healthy as possible so that they can perform for the country, the economy, and it is also a way of minimizing the expense, the health expense of a country. The sooner you attack a medical problem, the easier it is to solve. So these are concepts that, for some reason, are very difficult to explain, but they are so powerful in terms of what they can provide to a country and its people. I talk a lot to friends and other audiences about the concepts of healthcare and education. And I always say the same thing. What better two things can a government provide to its people than these two?
And is there a cost for education in Cuba? It's all free.
Yep. As you can go to as high as you can achieve.
PhD.
Some people cannot achieve a PhD. Some people cannot achieve a university degrees. But there are schools where you can become an electrician. There are schools that you can become a plumber. There are schools that you can become. And you can attend to any of them, but you are willing to perform the job for it. Now, in exchange of that, you will be working for the government once you graduate,
Right.
for a number of years until you decide to do something else. It's like military service, so to speak.
Right. Like the IDF.
Right.
Cuba has more doctors per population than most of the countries in the world. And it is admirable that you don't even have to go to a doctor, they come to you.
I'm curious, you know, I don't have these statistics or anything, but I'm curious what the, you know, life expectancy and standard of living and things like that is in Cuba versus, like, obviously it's a much bigger population, but the United States, you know?
Life expectancy is higher in Cuba than the US, and infant mortality is lower than it is in the US. Because pregnant mothers are given special treatment. Now, I know that there is a lot of debate about Cuban doctors and how they're used to be rented to other countries for the government to make money and all that kind of stuff. I understand the concept. I know that it is a very important revenue source for Cuba. I know that a lot of people talk about it in terms of you're exploiting the medical system that you built in Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that are debatable. But I usually compare it to other countries that rent their military to other countries to protect them, like our troops in the Middle East. I'd much rather have a country that rents doctors than a country that rents soldiers.
Well, there's obviously a lot to, you know, debate with, like, the politics with Cuba and the US and all of that. I think one thing that's not debatable is the art that has come out of Cuba has, you know, such beautiful music and visual art. Cindy, I know you have a particular interest in Cuban art. I'm wondering if you can, like, how has Cuban art impacted the world that we live in?
Oh, well, not many people know, you know, about Cuban art, but when they go to Cuba and they see it, then they're blown away. You know, they're surprised that it hasn't been more prominent in the US. It's the value of Cuban art in the US has been growing. So what I'm trying to do is the artist that I represent has never been shown in the US, but he's got his first show coming up in February. So just bringing the exposure.
Can you tell us who he is?
I can. His name is Enrique Avila, and he's actually very well known in Cuba for being the artist who created the sculpture. I don't know, it's an iconic picture, but when you think of Cuba, you think of the building with the sculpture of Che Guevara. Do you know which one I'm talking about? He's the artist who did that. And that's in Revolutionary Square. And every leader who has ever come to Cuba gets their picture there. Obama did, Prince Charles did, the Pope did. So it's like a big deal there.
And you find that, you know, I feel like art was limited for a long time in Cuba. There was, you know, I don't even know if you were allowed to be, were you allowed to be an artist when you lived there, Saul?
Yes, yes, yes. I think I understand where you're going through, which is the San Isidro's events that are going on in Cuba. But let me interject something to what Cindy was saying, and it has a lot to do with Yiddish Guides, so to speak. One of the groups that came with us to visit Cuba recently, it was end of last year, was a graphic designer. And one of the things that we do is we take the groups to see art in different places so that they can learn and understand and see Cuban art.
Mhm.
And he bought a couple of pieces from this gallery, and he fell in love with the guy who did these two pieces. So after he came back, he came over back to me and contacted me here in the States. And he says, I want you to find out who this guy is, where he lives. I want to talk to him. I said, all right, I'll figure it out. So we located him, we talked about it, and I said to him, all right, what do you want to do now that we have all this information? He says, I want you to make a deal with him. This guy is a graphic designer as well, an artist.
Mhm.
And the American Jew graphic designers wanted it to make a deal with him for the Cuban guy to produce graphic designs for a Haggadah, a Passover Haggadah. So he has made, I think, almost 20 different graphic designs of the history of the Jews in Egypt and the diaspora and the all the things that you see in a typical Haggadah, but with a Cuban perspective, with a different guy, and it is beautiful. It's still being edited, but this is an example of how a group that comes to Cuba, Jewish group that comes to Cuba and meets Cuban people with the ability to do things such as art or graphic designs, can create commerce between the two countries. He is paying this guy for his work, which is being done all digitally, and he sends all the digitalized renderings to him, and he's editing a book based on that. So this is the beauty of getting the two peoples together to learn from each other and to actually produce something that is mutually beneficial and
Yeah.
beautiful as well.
Building bridges.
And it has a Jewish background to it, which is one of the things that I enjoy most.
And what a beautiful way to, bring exposure of, Cuban culture and history and tie it in with our.
They've become the best of friends. As a matter of fact, because of the situation in Cuba with COVID and the economy and all that, he has asked me, and we have found ways for the guy here in the US to be able to send food to this guy in Cuba.
Amazing.
So that he can help him a little bit, not only with payments that he does for his art, but also with some supplies that he needs and medicines and all that kind of stuff.
Amazing. Well, I think that what you all are doing and creating awareness around the Cuban Jewish culture and building bridges in that way, it's a mitzvah. So thank you for doing that. And again, if anyone is interested, I put the links for the Chateau Blanc and your travel agency, and also Pack for a Purpose in the comments here. I did have a comment here that it says from Sharon that says, interesting and informative today. Thank you to both of you. And thank you guys so much. Muchísimas gracias. And yeah, keep us posted how we can